My talk today is called The Violence of Benevolence. I'm just going to start my timer. The Violence of Benevolence and the Struggle for Women's Rights in Iran. And it's divided into three parts: the state, the women, and the violence of benevolence. And it's very important to me to get to the part that's in the title, obviously. So I hope you'll indulge me, and I hope it won't take too much of your time. But let me start with the state. Now, many news outlets in Iran have pointed out the seeming, spontaneity or suddenness, not just in Iran, but in general, these recent uprisings. They've pointed out the suddenness, the spontaneity, but they've also tried to understand whether this is the start of a social movement or even a revolution. Now, others have argued that the vehement responses to the many forms of injustice and state violence are driven by provocateurs from outside of Iran. Iran's leader has called them the Dushman. However, I actually want to consider that these uprisings not only originate from within Iran, but that the conditions of possibility exist from within, and that these protesters are drawing on the very promises of the revolution that they, their parents, and now their grandparents were assured some 40 years ago. That is, their expectations are neither sudden nor unexpected, and nor are they outside of the conditions of possibility of the Islamic Republic of Iran. And I want to turn now to just a snippet from some of my research. When I was in Iran, I go every year, and I haven't gone during the COVID years, but since 1999, I have gone to Iran every year for periods between a couple of weeks to 4 or 5 months. So I was there in the summer of 2012, and the Islamic Republic had convened their first international conference on women and Islamic awakening. And it was a conference hosted by female intellectuals and scholars from all over the world. It was hosted in Iran, but they were inviting people from all over the world. And the Iranian press boasted the participation of over 1,500 female researchers, scholars, social activists from over 80 countries. And they presented over 450 papers. At the time, the president, Mahmoud Ahmadinejad, delivered this inaugural speech opening the conference. And I was there, I was watching it on television. It was live television. And he spoke to this convention hall, assembled of mostly women invited from other countries and senior Iranian officials. And he began by asking why the role of women is so important in Islam, and that what awakening means in this context. And he spoke of women's unique capacities for muhibbat, loving kindness, mehrabuni, compassion, tarbiyat, nurturing, and in providing help, kumak, and respect, ihtiram. And he went on to say, women stand shoulder to shoulder with men. They provide the seat of love and kindness for all human beings. His language spoke about what a big job women have. And he mirrored and almost verbatim used the very same terms that Khomeini had used, that women stand shoulder to shoulder with men. The supreme leader was also at the conference and made remarks and said that Islam believes that a woman is honorable, dignified, and progressive, and believes that a woman has an independent character and identity. Again, mirroring the terms that Khomeini used. So to consider women's rights and roles in the Islamic Republic, we might return to the revolutionary era when some of this language that I just quoted was actually being mobilized by Khomeini and others as part of the broader promises afforded in the discourses that emphasized women's roles and status in this new Islamic Republic. At the time, revolutionary leaders used women's status as a primary locus of the revolution, literally the site of the nation's rehabilitation, where the nation's rehabilitation would take place. But at the same time, they raised women's issues to be markers of the state's very legitimacy as well. And discourses about women's objectification stress the need to focus on women's intellectual development. This in turn intensified the focus on women's education and productive social and political participation. So the emphasis on women's status and their expectation of better treatment, dignity and respect, not to mention equal rights, in the post-revolutionary era was of a piece with Khomeini's designation of women's status as central to the much broader aim of creating an Islamic government, hukumat-e Islami, politically, discursively, legally, and materially. And you'll notice there's a difference, right, between Islamic government and Islamic republic. Just after the Iranian Revolution, the leaders of Iran's transitional government had a discussion about the name of the new political system. And I took a quick look at the attendees, and I'm sure many of you know about this, but just I'll remind you that the name of this new polity was up for part of the referendum. So in preparation for that March 30th referendum, some people suggested the name should be the People's Republic of Iran. Others suggested the Democratic Republic of Iran. And others said, no, it should be the Democratic Islamic Republic of Iran, or just the Republic of Iran. And to these suggestions, Khomeini responded with forceful statements about the nature of the new polity. And he said, and I quote, when the nation wants an Islamic republic, what the nation wants, is an Islamic republic, not one word more, not one word less, not just a republic, not just a democratic republic, not a democratic Islamic republic. Do not use the word democratic to describe it. This is the Western style. Now, obviously, Khomeini was instructing on this much larger aim of the revolution with his explicit anti-Western, anti-imperialist agenda. And he expanded on this in a famed interview with Italian journalist Oriana Fallaci, who asked him why he opposed the word democracy. And he said, to begin with, the word Islam does not need adjectives such as democratic, precisely because Islam is everything. It means everything. It is sad for us to add another word near the word Islam, which is perfection. Besides, the democracy which you so love, he's talking to Fallaci, and that you consider so valuable, does not have any precise meaning. And he goes on to, talk about the ambiguity of the word democracy. Now, in the end, the country, as we all know, is the Islamic Republic of Iran, as it was ultimately named. And this constituted a strategic formation, one, again, that highlighted this idea that it was neither East nor West, but Islamic Republic. And it emphasized Iran's need for political, social, and economic independence. Indeed, what Khomeini's thoughts about democracy were is difficult to say with specificity. It's just that I think his antipathy to democracy and the idea that Islam holds answers to all questions, notwithstanding, the fact that he placed women's issues and the improvements in their status as primary revolutionary aims, he and the new leaders were also committing the post-revolutionary state to address women's concerns. And here I want to argue that it was not just democracy in all of its abstraction that created or would have created spaces for claiming women's rights. Rather, it was the ensuing republic alongside Islamic principles through which women, and of course many others, came to seek remedies. And this is why I'm saying they were within the conditions of possibility that the Islamic Republic of Iran itself provided, if unwittingly. And so we cannot escape the fact that women, or the status of women in Iran, became important elements of the revolution because during the revolutionary era, the leaders spoke about elevating women's status. And the emphasis resulted in the women's expectation of better treatment in the post-revolutionary era. So now I want to turn a little bit to my work and the women. And I want to refer back to my time at Stanford when I started my graduate work in anthropology. And I did so, after reading about the situation of women in Iran just after the revolution. And, much of the scholarship had noted that women in Iran had no rights, they lost all their rights. And others noted that women did have rights, but they were being construed through Islam, an Islamic framework, if you will. So as a graduate student who knew very little, I set about to better understand the question, given all the, reading that I had done. This was up in, the 80s up until the early 90s. And the question was, so how do the women themselves in Iran understand their rights post-revolutionary period? And so, because I myself was trained as a lawyer in the United States and I practiced law, I thought I would focus on, talking to other lawyers. And so when I went to Iran, I spent a lot of time for that first project, the Project on Women's Rights, sitting in lawyers' offices. And I want to say to the audience here, the most remarkable aspect of that setting for me was just how unremarkable it was from the standpoint of law and legal practice. And this was underscored for me just weeks into my first trip to Iran in 1999. And as a graduate student, as a PhD student in anthropology, I stayed there for a full 12 months. So I went right around Eid, New Year's, March 1999, great time to be in Iran. And I stayed until 2000. So at the time I entered the office of an attorney who'd been practicing law for almost 30 years. So her legal career spanned the period before the revolution and continued after. Now, I, like I said, was armed with my knowledge from scholarly books and articles on women in Iran. And I quickly got to the point, and I said to this woman lawyer, I said, I'm interested in how women in Iran are seeking their rights through Islam, because that's what I had been reading. Now, without missing a beat, this lawyer said, well, I can't help you here. We have civil codes in Iran and civil courts. This is a law office. I'm a lawyer. I don't deal in Islam. I deal in law. And I want you to understand, if you want to understand women's rights, you need to learn how the law operates. You need to go to the courts and see for yourself how women are getting their rights. To say the least, I was surprised by this response, which was very different from what I was reading as a graduate student in Palo Alto, California. I was surprised because this response said to me it was civil law and procedure and not some generalized platitudes about women, respect for women's rights, through which the women themselves were seeking redress for their grievances. Indeed, this attention to legal process emerged as a central focus of my research for what it reveals, not just about disputing processes, but about the politics of rights and the operations of power and gender relations, but especially subject formation in Iran. And I'll talk a little bit about subject formation in a second, but many know that during the 1979 revolution, leaders sought to challenge Iran's emulation, if you will, of Western societies and aimed to turn the country to some authentic cultural values. And this struck a chord with a broad cross-section of the population. And so many groups came together to overthrow a monarchy and establish a representative government through what ultimately became an Islamic republic. And as I said, this was a compromise, the effects of which continue to be seen today. And among those effects was the politicization of what I call rights talk by state and non-state actors. And by politicization of rights talk, what I'm referring to is that this critique of the language of rights that was made by numerous revolutionary forces at the time for being indicative of the ills of Western individualism, when the basis, they argued, of a healthy society should be the family, and women, as the crowning jewel of the family, Kian Khanavadeh, would be its focus. And so individuals' needs were to yield to greater social concerns. So rights talk, women's rights, in this context became a verbal index for a sense of entitlement without responsibility, thought to be the source of much of the ills of Western societies characterized by excess and anomie. In 1979, revolutionary actors mobilized images of Iranian women dressed in the black chador as symbolic foils to individuated Western women who were objectified, commodified, hypersexualized, and thus unemancipated and oppressed. And the 1983 Veiling Act was legislated in tandem with the discourse of rehabilitating women and restoring them to a place of respect. And of course, this rehabilitation and restoration was happening on the bodies of women, but it was speaking to a broader national change. The chador was symbolic, not just of the renewed status of women, but of a collective shift born by women toward a religio-national idea of Iran that represented the triumph of the revolution over Western values. Now, many of you are familiar with this story, so my aim isn't simply to repeat it. Instead, what I want to do is think about the significance of the promise to improve women's status as a primary revolutionary goal. By placing women's issues in central focus, the resulting government would now be held accountable for those promises. What's more, as a legitimating factor of the revolution, women's status would now forever be tied to the state's own legitimacy. Now, of course, what improving women's status meant and how it was achieved would be the substance of struggles yet to come. And one of the earliest instances in which we saw the struggle, of course, was International Women's Day, March 1979, when tens of thousands of women and some men flooded urban centers to protest the suspension of the Family Protection Act that had given women some new rights in divorce and possibly other setbacks that were being discussed at the time, including mandatory veiling, which we know did happen, and the revocation of women's suffrage, which did not. Now, to protest these actions, women fought back and held up signs that made their grievances known. Again, we all know, many of us know this story. I want to focus on the way they made their claims. They called for equality. They called for women's rights. So in response, because of that very discourse, they were dubbed Western puppets and Barbie dolls, and they were attacked. And this was an illustration of some of the fractures within the popular struggle to remove a monarch. Just what to emerge was, as of then, uncertain, and people were divided. Here we also see the association of a language of rights with the excesses of imperialism, where the language of rights began to be disassociated from the language of women's status. Huquq Zan was now giving way to a more popular discourse, Mawqiyat Zan. In fact, when I was going to Iran and I spoke with a very well-known Iranian exile woman who was in the previous government in a cabinet position, said to me, don't say that you're going to study women's rights. Say that you're going to study women's status, Mawqiyat Zan. And this distinction became very important to me, especially as this person indicated to me that it had political significance, salience. And this is part of what influenced my surprise when I went to Iran and I went to the lawyer's office and she told me, no, like we're dealing with women's rights. We have civil codes, civil laws. And I was like, why this mismatch? How did this emerge, right? And so, I did follow what that lawyer said to me, and I went to the courts. And I was surprised again and again to find my interlocutors, women asking for divorce in the courts, or women in law firms, or in other venues, that my interlocutors, most of them pious Muslim women, many of them supportive of the revolution, if not the Islamic Republic, they spoke in a language of rights, not of Islamic values, but of the rule of law. Now, to understand the significance of making rights claims today, we need to recall that Khomeini's thesis for Islamic government, hukumat, had no use for a lawmaking body. There was no need for so-called man-made laws, as God's law is the all that mattered, and even the legislative body didn't need to exist and should be dissolved. So here we are, 20 years later when I first started my research, or 40 some odd years later today. What becomes significant is that the Islamic Republic not only retained the legislative branch of government, but also the civil courts as a venue for adjudication, and the civil code as the formal expression of law. So what this lawyer was pointing out to me about the civil law was important. All of these factors in the legal system, you see, have tangible consequences for a system of rights. And it was all done after Khomeini had nullified and invalidated code law, including family protection law. And what happened was that this legal blending, Islamic values, Republican form of government, disrupted a conventional symmetry between the Sharia, and state-administered law, which had existed for many years. And for the first time ever, the Sharia was given unambiguous legal code through its codification. Now, this is important because as a socio-legal scholar, I can tell you that civil codes and legal procedures carry with them effects, whether it's in the United States, whether it's in France, whether it's in Iran. They carry with them subject-making effects. I become a person who is thinking about my individuality and my subjectivity through what the law requires. As apparatuses of a republic, the institutions of the state require subjects to operate as rights-bearing individuals, particularly when interacting with those institutions. So what I'm trying to say is that if I am a woman in Iran and I have to go to court to get a divorce, I better think of myself as an individuated subject with rights, because that's the only way I can access this legal system. If I think of myself through this sort of relational framework of being a wife and a mother, then that is not going to get me where I need to go. And the Republic system, Islamic Republic system, actually created and legitimized this possibility for women. So one of the consequences of this uneasy union between codification and Sharia was in the family law codes. Women were required to make use of the legal scaffold. Initially, men were not. Men only had to go and say, I want a divorce. They didn't have to give any cause or offer any proof. Women, however, had to make a case for themselves. They had to offer evidence. They had to give evidence. They had to state a claim. All these things that we do when we go to court in the United States, or your lawyer does for you. But as the women did this, right, they necessarily had to come and think of themselves as autonomous beings, bearers of rights. In order to outline their cases in civil courts, they needed to employ a rights-based understanding. themselves, of their status vis-a-vis the state. Precisely what the revolution had cautioned against. In the end, it was Islam, Islamic values, principles, if you will, that were made to accommodate the Republican state framework. And as it did, it produced or re-authenticated, let's say, liberal subjects who are liberal by virtue of being individual, thinking of themselves as rights bearers. And this we see in many segments of society, not just legal, but that's my area of research, right? So even if the Islamic Republic made women the grounds on which political disputes over sovereignty were fought, the effects of those disputes were conspicuously forms that were liberal. Through the nation-state form of the Republic, the institutions of the state comprise the tangible apparatus of everyday life and shape sensibilities, affect, subjectivity, and ultimately practice. So you see, it was with this understanding that the lawyer insisted I need to go to the courts to see what she saw every day, what was so apparent that women and men, judges and adversarial parties were discussing their rights, not their status. And it is here that I redirect your attention to the remarkable unremarkability of these law offices, where the civil process mediated by lawyers is remarkably and powerfully making ordinary citizens stand up for promises of their rights. Now, I want to address this idea that I raised earlier, that the conditions of possibility of the Islamic Republic allow for both expectation and change, whether it's, in the courts or in the streets among these amazing young people that we see. So let me turn to the protests and the idea of women's rights as well. The possibilities and opportunities they present Iranian leaders today render women's expectations not only legitimate, but actually legitimating to the state. That is, if improvements in the conditions of women's lives was one of the foundational claims of the ongoing Inqilab Islami, Islamic Revolution, and women today, alongside men, are out in the streets protesting the injustices and violence at the hands of the state, they're also making a claim about the failure of both the state and the Inqilab Islami. This attempt to forge an Islamic government in the name of improving women's status contributed to the post-revolutionary movement in some unexpected ways. Since that period, in which women themselves played important roles, women's issues have gained a permanent foothold in state politics, and their concerns are now part of the broader issues of social justice affecting the entire nation and its revolutionary aim to create, ostensibly, a more just society. Now, as I said earlier, just what improvements in women's status mean or how they come about is the subject of much discussion and tension. And here's where I want to turn to the last bit of my talk today, the violence of benevolence. When I was doing that first fieldwork in Iran in 1999 through 2000, we witnessed a period at that time during the Khatami presidency. Many refer to it as the reformist period. What I found interesting at that time was Khatami, the president's emphasis on the rule of law. And again, this was a very clever move to try to render a legal system that would be made to accommodate Islam as opposed to the other way around. And some of you may remember in 2000, there were protests in that summer, 1999, the closing of the newspaper Salam. And it contributed to manifestations, protests in the streets after Iranian forces raided the Tehran University's dormitories and killed and beat up students. And if you remember, Khatami went, the students wanted Khatami to come, and Khatami wouldn't come. And the word on the street was that he's afraid. And it was a time when many people came to this realization of what the limits of the Republic were, because the rumor was that Khatami was afraid because he had no police forces. What does that mean? That the president, who was elected by 80% of eligible voters, doesn't have his own police forces. So my journalist friend came to my house, and he was in the streets. I was not, to be honest with you. And he said, it's amazing what's going on in the streets. And this is, again, 1999. And he said, you see these women and they're protesting in their hijab. And one woman, she pulled at her manto and said, in 20 years, what have you given us? And then the journalist who was at my house said to me, the problem is people are just not willing to die for this. And he gestured at a faux manteau. Now here we are some 23 years later. People are willing to die for this. And we have to understand, where did this come from? In what space did this emerge? So I want to talk about something. This is the most experimental part of my talk, and I would love your feedback. So please bear with me and ask me questions if it doesn't make sense. But the survival of Khomeini's Islamic Republic over 40 years is a study, I would argue, of populism, what Daniel Brumberg has called authoritarian populism, which embodies a kind of structural instrumentalism for political expediency. Ervand Abrahamian said that, and symbolic utopianism. Hamid Dabashi said that. But its most enduring trait, Daniel Brumberg says, is the twin valorization of a zealous quest for utopia alongside the pragmatic struggle for a political order. And anthropologist and somebody whose work I'm very influenced by, Michael Fisher, has said, we cannot fully grasp the dynamic instabilities that have ensued from this wedding of contending authorities, Islam, republicanism. Now, today's protests in Iran, of course, challenge not just, I would say, Islamic government, but this our challenge is not just to Islamic Republic, but Islamic government, which Khomeini always thought was the final entity that would emerge, Hukumat-e-Islami. And this is so as much for reformists who drew from dynamic interpretations of sacred texts to address real-world concerns that, as I said, were framed in the language of rights, the rule of law, and political participation, as it is for principalists like Ahmadinejad, who I started with, who, as Iranian, was Iran's president and hewed very closely to Khomeini's legacy in its materialist appeals to the common people, the dispossessed, and used class-based language as a matter, in his, and also in his mannerisms, his dress, and his physical comportment of being sort of a simple man. But what I want to argue is that while others have noted that there is this materialist quality to this, we in the West, right, we read this as not a challenge to rights. We see this as, yes, this is a materialist language, we're thinking about workers, rights. We're always thinking about this relationship between rights and the state, especially when we see this language of appealing to the common people. But I think what we are actually seeing is a re-entrenchment of undemocratic and non-Republican policies premised on benevolence, premised on these ideas about compassion and charity. After 4 decades, what becomes apparent is that this is not democracy. It's not that democracy lacked precision, as Khomeini had said. It was the Republic that lacked precision. And the lack of understanding about such a form of government and the kinds of citizens or subjects it entails led to a closing down of the very possibilities, a violent closing down, that the Islamic Republic had itself established, created, ensued, entailed. But it would be facile to suggest that the relatively few people in society who occupy this place are the bulwark of this enduring system. I have two qualifications. What I want to say is that this system, what I'm talking about is the ensuing, the ousting of the republic and trying to replace it with government, hukumat, as opposed to jomhuri, and replace it with these ideas of charity, benevolence, is part of a much broader framework that we see in all aspects of society, including sort of like tort law, automobile accidents. And this value, benevolence, is being cultivated part and parcel of a broader set of embedded social practices and ethical and religious values, like I said, charity, benevolence, which are deeply embedded in Shi'i Islam and in the person of Imam Ali. This system is premised on a set of relations that is hierarchical and uneven. It is gendered, reactionary, and one that mirrors the reality of people's lives socially and economically. It speaks for the need of honor through charity and benevolence. This unequal and hierarchical set of relations does not speak of a redistribution that classic Marxists would, but of a reciprocation. The state invests in and helps circulate a moral economy of benevolence where the owner of the right of retribution, this is my second book project, now bestows her gift of forbearance, a selfless act of grace, but also an exercise of agency, and a subject position of exemplary citizen to be inhabited. And she does this often publicly. And what I want to do is argue that this idea of benevolence is actually not unique to Iran in this period. It is in the discourse of humanitarianism as well. And while it is not the discourse of human rights purists and activists calling for equality and economic redistribution, what I think eludes them is that benevolence and charity are also the substitute frameworks for Western human rights that is moving away from talking about equality and increasingly towards exactly the kinds of things that some Western populists speak about: charity, benevolence, not redistribution. There is, what I'm trying to say is that there is in calls for charity, benevolence, a neoliberal redefining of democratic principles and of human rights that are giving way, not just in Iran, but globally. And what I think Iran today can teach us about democracy, even in its denial of democracy, is that we in diverse societies are also still operating from these ideas of charity and honor, if you will, and that these appeals are not appeals to human rights and democracy, but a different set of values premised on and that thrive in egalitarian societies. So it's just really, I guess, to point out that the violence of benevolence is global. What Iranians in the streets today are fighting for, their rights, is something that is amazing and is also a challenge to the broader global sense of the spread of humanitarian charity and benevolence and the eclipse of rights. So that's where I'll end it. Thank you so much for your attention, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you so much, Professor. We have a few questions and comments coming in. Is this benevolence that you mentioned potentially also just a disguise for common misogynistic rhetoric in some way?
Yeah, you can possibly say that. The reason we might call it misogynistic rhetoric is because it's embedded in social. Sorry, I'm stopping my timer too. It's embedded in social mores that go back to these ideas that like I read before, women are the kiana chanavode, and women are the jewel of the family, and we need to have women at home so they can raise their women. But it is very much in contradiction to the kinds of talk that we also heard about women are dignified and they should be part of the political system. So yes, but I also want to point out that it's unclear, even from, we give a lot of authority to claims that, for instance, Khomeini or what have you made. But I also think that they're very unclear about what they're promising and what they're saying.
Thank you. One viewer writes, how can the culture change from simple equality into believing that now is the golden age of women's leadership?
I think that's a brilliant question. And I think that Iran is a terrific example for the defiance that we're seeing, the sense of righteousness that we're seeing. But again, I'm sorry if the last part of my talk was a little bit confusing, but again, what I'm so impressed with the protests in Iran is the language of equal rights. We're not trying to sort of get people to be benevolent and give us charity. No, we're here, we want what's ours. And I'll just say quickly, one thing, when I was doing my fieldwork for the book on women's rights, when I came back to Stanford, a bunch of us graduate students went out to lunch, and somebody said to me, in one sentence, how would you describe your research in Iran? And I said, something that women said to me over and over again was that rights are not given. You have to go get them. So گرفتنی دادنی نیست گرفتنی. And this kind of sharp, astute sense of their place in society is something that I think we in the United States, all over the world, can really learn from. I don't know if I answered the question very well, but I think we're coming up, right? We're doing what we can to make those places of leadership.
Thank you. Another viewer writes, how are men treating their wives and daughters in Iran? And perhaps what is the role of men in general in the legal system, in the current protests? How is the family unit being affected now?
This is a terrific question, and I can't answer it, to be honest with you, fully without doing empirical research, because it would really be pure speculation on my part. So if you will indulge me, let me give you a little bit of educated speculation, because I do talk to people a lot. And one of the things that people in the street, if you will, have said to me is that there's this tremendous hambastigi, this tremendous sort of people togetherness. And I in my head, I have so many examples, but I could go both ways, right? I can say, I used to be an immigration lawyer, so I would go to Iran, and people would always say to me, can you help me? My son is fine, but I want my daughter to go to the United States because I want her to have all the rights and opportunities. So there is this, but also, I did research in the criminal courts as well. And there is a lot of violence against women that goes, that needs to be adjudicated. But I don't think, you'll forgive me if I don't think it's so unique to Iran or Iranian men, because we have problems with violence against women in many societies. I do think, though, that there is, I grew up in the United States. I always tell people, so my family came to the United States in 1970. I was already born, so you get a sense of how old I am, very old. But what I want to say is when I go to Iran and I talk to young people, I am astonished by the sense of being self-possessed, self-confidence that these young women have. And I see it way more in Iran, I have to say, than in the United States. And it's very impressive to see that power. And I've been thinking a lot about, like I said, where it comes from, which part of in my talk I tried to partly think about.
Thank you. Another viewer writes, since civil rights are always bound together with civil obligations, how has the law in Iran functioned in forming such obligations?
Wow, that's a terrific question. I think many of the people who I talk to now, remember, these are people who are seeking redress for grievances, right, in courts. So obviously these people have grievances, and what they feel is that there's a lot of responsibility. You know, women, men too, there's a lot of social responsibility. There's a lot of people telling you how to live your life. So we need some guarantees, some of the guarantees in, the Constitution, what our parents and grandparents fought for to come about. So I think there is tremendous dissatisfaction with the level of responsibility and the imposition and enforcement of that responsibility, particularly on the heads or backs of women. And then, what are we getting after 20 years? That kind of sense. Just a side note, again, many of you who grew up in Iran or participated in the revolution know this better than me. But, one of the things many of my interlocutors told me was, we didn't go into the streets to have an Islamic revolution. We were promised free electricity. Khomeini said we should be getting free gas and electricity. That's what I want. Where's my free gas and electricity? So there were these materialist claims that people were very dissatisfied of not receiving.
Thank you. I'm going to read a comment question from a viewer. They write, I'm not sure if I misunderstood or not, but I believe you spoke about how post-revolutionary Sharia law gave women a sense of individualism and autonomy because their newfound legal system included various hurdles for women. Could you elaborate on this? Do you think this was a new organic phenomenon, or was it the regurgitation of pre-revolutionary social and legal empowerment?
Oh, thank you for asking that clarifying question, because I do think that might be a place where some people misunderstand what I'm saying. I'm not saying that Sharia law gave people things. What I'm saying is that the civil legal process through which the law that some say, it's the state's interpretation, first of all, of the Sharia. And these are Islamic principles, and they're codified, but they are disassociated from their underlying sort of moral values. And they're just codified as like Article 1133, divorce. Men can divorce their wives without cause, for instance. What I'm saying is that the legal procedures that the state unwittingly set in place created a system in which some people, one party, the aggrieved woman in that party, had to go to court to make a claim. In order to go to court to make a claim, you have to think of yourself as an individual, as somebody who is empowered, has rights vis-a-vis the state, and then you have to go and argue for those. And this has an effect on making a subject. And in the first 20 years of Iran's Islamic Republic, men did not need to go to court. Men did not need to even state a claim. Today they do. And their footing has been off for many years because they have not had this kind of subjectivization, this kind of training on how to go to court and think of themselves. And so what I'm trying to say is that this has rippling effects throughout society where women, because of the way that the law is framed and procedurally operated in operation, it creates a certain kind of subject, a subject of the law who has rights and is endowed with rights and has an expectation that the state guarantee those rights. Does that make sense? Does that make more sense? I hope it does.
Thank you. Another viewer writes, why do you think the claims on charity and benevolence rather than rights is anything but empty rhetoric to cling to power at all costs, despite the clear evidence that the underclass under the Islamic Republic or the Islamic government is suffering far more than under previous systems?
No, that's exactly what I'm saying. I'm saying that when we turn our attention to charity, compassion, benevolence, we are just granting another actor to have power over us. And this, what I think happened, just if I can just be very clear, is that the Islamic Republic, Khomeini said, oh, democracy is imprecise, but we'll take a republic. But he didn't realize what the republic allowed or entailed, these subjects of rights, right? And so over the past however many years, I think since that protest that closed Salam and Khatami and all that I described, I think there has been an undermining of that branch, the republic, those aspects of the government that are republic, to try to forge a hukumat born out of benevolence, which some might say is empty rhetoric. But the aim is to undermine, again, the endowed subject of rights who's a citizen of the state in this shared compact. And that's why I said that they didn't realize when they created this Islamic Republic, they unwittingly set off this rippling effect of people who became expectant of certain guarantees, particularly the women, because the women were such an important role in the revolution in the first place. I hope that makes more sense.
Thank you. One viewer writes, Khomeini in 1963 opposed women's suffrage, but he recognized the power of women. Is it possible that he's disingenuously supporting the cause of women in order to create the coalition he needed to win?
This was a very important point that became very salient in that election, in that vote for the referendum. And that's exactly true. That's exactly what happened. And there have been other times, many of you know, where they've played with that exact thing, where they lowered the age of voting to like 15 and then 18. So they've played around with it. But Khomeini realized that that was a constituency that he needed. So in the end, he did change his position on it.
Thank you. Another question. So do you basically think that the inclusion of rights discourse in law applying to women was accidental? Will the regime roll these rights back once they realize that it's unwittingly created rights-bearing subjects with autonomy and agency? It sounds like they essentially trained many women to self-advocate using the law as a tool, specifically rights.
Thank you so much. That was a really well-stated question. I just want to clarify that yes, it was unwittingly, it was unexpected, but it wasn't that they allowed it to happen or something. Yeah, I just think they didn't realize that that's, if you have a republic, you're going to create this kind of situation. I also want to say that the women, it's not that they, like on the one hand, they learned this because if they were going to go to courts and whatnot. But remember, at the time of the revolution, the 1979 protests, they were already using that language. What is interesting to me, and actually somebody said this to me when I was in Iran about human rights, it's not that women's rights are in conflict with rights in, democratic society. It's just that now I'm quoting the person, in our society, we have studied and Islam has authenticated these rights. So now what's happened, it's kind of, I don't want to laugh, but it's kind of funny because what they did was that without realizing it, so first they were critical of the language of rights, saying this is the tool of Western imperialist forces. Then unwittingly, they re-authenticated rights. So now what the women are saying is, we're using the language that comes from the Islamic Republic. That's why at the beginning of my talk, I said this comes from the conditions of possibility from within this society, not without. So the argument that, these are like dushman from outside is totally undermined. Do you see what I'm saying?
Thank you. We're coming up on time. I just wanted to ask one last question that's maybe a little bit forward looking. You said you aren't surprised, or maybe others shouldn't be surprised necessarily by what is happening in Iran right now, especially with the role that women are playing. Is there anything that does surprise you? Are you surprised at the government's response, at the role of men? What do you see as potentially the future? Can the government compromise on women's rights or make changes that would satisfy protesters? Just forward looking a little bit.
I'm not surprised. I mean, maybe I'm a little bit surprised by the youth, how young these people are. I'm not surprised by because like I said, like when I go to Iran for the past 20, like the self-confidence, the sense of like expectation of these young people is tremendous. I'm not surprised. I'm sorry to say, having done research for 10 years in the criminal courts, I'm not surprised by the government's response. I'm not surprised. I don't know. I think that many of us who study Iran know that there needs to be some kind of space saving for the state in order to do something. Okay, I'll tell you something that surprises me, and I'm just going to be very non-professional, I suppose. How stupid some of the people in the leadership are, because I think they could give not that much and it would be okay. But standing so harshly in the face of very legitimate concerns, that's what surprises me, I have to say.
Thank you, Professor. Thank you for a wonderful and very interesting talk, Professor Aslanloo. We hope to see you in person or Zoom in the future. Thank you for being part of our programming this quarter.
Thank you for having me. I really appreciate it.